Hello, welcome to today's session. We'll be talking about a topic in laboratory management that actually probably extends far beyond the laboratory, how we develop a resilient workplace. This is particularly important in laboratory management because, like it or not, in laboratory medicine, we do face crises. And the most recent COVID crisis is just the latest of these disasters that have come upon us. So I'll share my screen with you here, and we'll talk a little bit about the next sorts of things that we want to talk about in terms of this topic. Our objectives today being to just sort of summarize what the benefits are, both to the laboratory and the individuals, of working in a lab setting where there's a high degree of resilience. We'll talk about the factors that make individuals and organizations resilient and lasting, what this resilience is that we're trying to seek for. And then we'll talk about ways that laboratories and individuals can enhance that degree of resilience to help achieve this goal. Hopefully, through this process, you'll have come to the point where you want to become more resilient and make your own laboratory into that kind of thing. So what is resilience? Well, you know, it's sort of a newfangled fancy word for an old concept. It's the ability to respond to a variety of stresses without losing your effectiveness. So whether it's a high-tech fabric or mesh, whether it's a metal, it can endure certain types of stresses. This particular type of fabric is maybe not oriented towards resisting thermal or fire type of stresses, but it does quite well with sweat or with stretching and various physical manipulative stresses. And the same principles apply as we begin to think about how this is enacted in the laboratory. We need to think about the kind of stresses that we're looking for and that we have to be aware of and confront to be able to carry on our jobs. Well, so what are the stresses we deal with in the laboratory? Certainly this year we have dealt with COVID-19 pandemic throughout the world and the demands of testing, the demands of coping with quarantines and various other kinds of diseases. And that's just one example of sort of the medical and somewhat social side of disasters that can affect us. We also have the circumstances where, you know, just the workload can be a major stress on both the individuals and the team. Of course, he says here jokingly, you know, I'm wondering how old my kids are now that I'm finally caught up on work, just as his colleague is bringing the next round of work for him to do. And then lastly, you know, we all have circumstances where people suddenly disappear in the laboratory, whether for sickness or for political reasons or family causes or whatever. When there's a gap in the team, sometimes that creates a stress in terms of being able to carry on the work. How about individually? Well, individually, we all wear lots of different hats, whether we're a parent and a teacher, whether we're a spouse or a friend, whether we're a family member, whether we're an employee. All of those sorts of things confront us with many different roles that we have to fill. And of course, life itself has temporal demands. They have expectations of what other people want from us and what we can accomplish. We may have difficulties in various relationships, whether with significant others, with children. And then, of course, the whole issue of our own personal health comes into play as well, which is probably related very often to these stresses in life. So let's think about how we might begin to build a healthy organizational culture. What are the things that we should look for? What are the things that we should be striving for? One thing that many individuals will mention is this characteristic of transparency. And when we use that word, we're thinking about transparency in terms of, you know, what's going on in people's minds, what are their motives, what's going on with the company or the organization, what's the data show? What are people's goals and agendas? You know, what are the finances that are behind all of this? What are the realities of that? And understandably, sometimes people may not have the rosiest of finances in their company, and they don't want to let the employees know how how desperate things are because they may all jump ship. Well, those kinds of things will certainly lead to stresses in the organization and potentially a loss of resilience. Whereas creating a team with a high degree of transparency in these domains can be a big help. Another thing is that successful, healthy organizations have learned how to align the interests of the various stakeholders, the employees, the owners, customers, or patients. We've learned how to get those things to line up so that they become win-win, or win-win-win, or win-win-win-win-win. Everybody at the table is going to come away pleased with the outcome when those interests are aligned, and we can move forward together and see everyone benefit. Another characteristic is a high degree of accountability and responsibility. And this is not just accountability in a vertical sense. This is a mutual round the table kind of accountability. We hold each other accountable to do what we say and accomplish what we intend to accomplish. And if we don't, to freely admit and recognize that and understand what we can do to compensate for that. And we can similarly look to others around the table to help us achieve things where we may be falling short, because we are mutually accountable and we are mutually responsible, as well as being individually accountable and individually responsible. That indifference to the group versus the individual is very important in a healthy culture. The team and the individual's interests are lined up, and likewise their accountability meshes together very closely. Now, understandably, healthy organizations can make wrong decisions. They can make mistakes, but by and large, when you look at those that are really going to be successful and have the cause to which people will rally and cling during times, are those organizations where there really is this intense commitment to do it right, to not cut corners, to not abandon our ethics or our moral values in favor of an expediency. This is where integrity as an organization is also very important, and not just as individuals. Now, of course, integrity has to be the currency of a healthy organizational culture. You can't build a success on a lie. But this integrity covers several domains, for example. Both the things that we say and think, how we act, as well as how we really believe. And unless these things align fairly closely, we will undermine one or the other. Either our actions will undermine our words, or they will undermine our very emotions and create a tremendous internal stress that will then lead to either abandonment or failure under pressure. So this alignment, or this unity of integrity of both words, deeds, and feelings, emotions, is really quite important to maintain that equipoise that allows an organization and individuals to go forward. Another key characteristic of healthy organizations is that they learn from their mistakes. And that means that they are not interested in brushing aside their mistakes. They're interested in using those failures as part of the learning cycle, because that will engender success. Now, a lot has been made of this in the current business literature. You've probably heard the admonition to fail early and often as a means of trying to accelerate this cycle so that you can ultimately spin off success. But whether you're trying, 700 different filaments to make an electric light bulb, or trying 6 or 7 different team combinations to find the one that will be the starting lineup for your NBA basketball team, we have to learn from what works and what doesn't alike if we're to really achieve success. It's not a once and done kind of process. Another characteristic that I think is highly important, and maybe a little bit harder to encapsulate in terms of specifics sometimes, is this collaborative, integrated, or holistic nature of our organization that values the involvement and engagement of multiple people on the team to enable success. In other words, there's no one big grand hero and everyone else is a subservient follower and facilitator. Now, we may know corporations that have, the high profile CEO and so forth, but in reality, oftentimes the most successful organizations are those where the teamwork is really clicking well, and that integrated nature of the processes are valued and celebrated and ultimately lead to greater success. Finally, I think it is vital that our considerations of failures or of other issues not be a concern of, it's all going to be great and grand and we're just going to sail happily through. The fact is that we oftentimes learn to become resilient by facing a disaster. And so whether it is a tsunami that destroys buildings and our whole community, whether it's a set of fires and landslides that create havoc, whether it's an earthquake, some other natural disaster, or whether it's just a hiccup in the world economic scene, we have to have the courage to face the setbacks and difficulties and express that in the way we communicate, in the way we plan, and the way we respond to show that we can become better and stronger as we work through a seemingly devastating setback. We can also look at individual resilience in the same manner and recognize that individuals with resilience have generally followed a variety of fairly similar practices and habits in their life to develop that resilience. Now, of course, those are individual choices, but organizations can likewise help to facilitate that development in people, can help them to learn to manage stress. They can offer opportunities or resources to manage some of the more common ones, whether that's childcare or relationship difficulties or whatever. We can encourage career development, encourage people to get new skills, develop a positive work environment where people feel engaged and excited to come to work. And this happens in part when we help them to see how what they're doing helps the big picture of processes, helps the intent that the organization has. Likewise, as we celebrate successes along the way, and maybe even hold debriefing sessions for failures jointly so that we can learn together from our failures, that can help with this process as well. I'll just share a couple of quick examples in our environment. Not too long ago, Chair Massage Wednesdays came into being, recognizing that the providers in our institution were under great duress with the COVID pandemic and the social isolation circumstances. This sort of response was healthy. Another friend responded by providing a little musical interlude, songs of comfort or encouragement and uplift, a way of sharing his talents to encourage resilience in this time. Yoga, lunchtime yoga was another very aptly received or happily received method of coping with some of the stresses of life. We mentioned career development, offering opportunities for people to gain new skills, whether it's in a social environment, whether it's online, whether it's through new responsibilities as you work along through and as you think of that. This kind of opportunity reflects an organization that is looking at its personnel force as the future and seeing that to be successful and resilient, they have to be people who have the skills to step up and take over as things move along. Celebrating success as well, we're long past the days when ticker tape parades would celebrate a new election victory or something, but there can be other ways, Donut Fridays or launch Saturdays or or other sorts of little successes that, that bring things into mind. Another thing that I think is really important, and I mentioned this, of course, and I'll use a historical example to illustrate this. This painting is a fairly famous depiction of the defeat of the Mongols in the 1200s in their invasion of Vietnam, or Tonkin. The leader who organized this was a still reputed, still respected individual named Trần Hưng Đạo. And the manner of defeat was quite unique. It involved lots and lots of soldiers. The Chinese and the Mongols had, literally hundreds of thousands of people, probably several hundred boats. And it was becoming evident that they were going to have to retreat. And so Trần Hưng Đạo organized his people to install little spikes, log spikes or pickets, essentially, just beneath the tidal line in the estuary that the retreating armies would have to follow. And as they sailed down into this river, having secured the site, sure enough, the tide went out and the ships were marooned and could not go further. Sometimes their hulls were punctured by these large spikes, and they were so-called sitting ducks for the armies and the other military forces that Trần Hưng Đạo had arrayed. But by creating in his men a vision of what this was, he was enabled to bring about one of the greatest defeats of a foreign military power ever in Vietnam, and perhaps even in the world, because that certainly stopped the forward marchings of the Mongol hordes during that era. Well, one of the key things to think about as we are building our workforce is that this really begins with the hiring process. And we need to think about how we select employees. So they may be somewhat interchangeable, just as these stones in the jewelry setting might be interchanged into that setting. But we want to look for employees that really do fit well with the task, and that they will fit well with our culture. Then, having done that, we can begin to think about cross-training, about developing some redundancy and skills, encouraging adaptability, and of course, as they come into the organization, properly orienting them so that they get a vision of the culture, that they get the appropriate competencies and training in the various skills that they will need to apply in their position. So we hire for resilience. We also deploy employees for resilience in ways that will enhance the organizational resilience. I've included also here an important feature in that I think it's very important for organizations to have a sound financial setting in order for both the employees and the organization to achieve resilience. This image is a classic example of someone, not really paying too much attention to the thin ice that's not too far nearby. But it wouldn't take much of a fall, and perhaps it's not a deep body of water. But many times financially, we get out onto thin ice. We get overextended. We think we can do more than we can with our financial reserves, or we employ questionable accounting practices that don't really take into account the actual needs that we have. And that's important to monitor both as an employee as well as a leader in the organization. And this is again where that concept of transparency comes in as well. Now, resilient organizations, I think, also have healthy relationships with their clients, with their vendors, with the public. And that's not to say they have to be advertising and putting on grand public relations campaigns, but there's a fundamental inherent respectfulness that other people's lives and fortunes are involved by what we do. And that's very, very important to retain within the organization and to foster amongst our employees and to recognize that we succeed together with these individuals. We don't just transact one transaction and go on to the next gullible victim. As we think about how we develop resilient thinking in our organization, one of the ways to do that is to conduct what's been termed a SWOT analysis. And SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it involves critically thinking about within our organization, where are our strengths, where are our weaknesses, what do we do well, what are we not so good at? And looking in our environment at where the opportunities are or where the threats may be, important competitors or changes in technology and so forth. From that analysis, then develop strategies, policies, and so forth that can lead to changes in the way we approach our work, both in the short term and potentially longer term as we develop longer term strategies. Now, this can be an ongoing process. It isn't a do it once and you're done. It's an ongoing evolutionary process that can engage people at multiple levels as well within the organization. And as we do that, there are several things that will help to further prioritize or encourage resilience. This first part, of course, is recognizing the reliability importance and using that kind of SWOT analysis or strategic planning to develop our plans for from day to day. We understand that work is very complex. A laboratory is an enormously complex place, both in terms of the science, the technology, as well as the human relations that are going on there. And so recognizing that complexity and engaging the diversity of views will help to see problems, solve problems sooner than if we have a single, one person decides and everything is done. In that construct, that complexity and that prioritization will help to strengthen leaders. And those leaders become the decision makers. Now, that they may have a title or they may not, but the really great leaders will incorporate different interests from a variety of the components of their organization to develop success. We've indicated that there's risk involved, and doing various sorts of tools like SWOT analysis, like failure mode analysis. All of those can be very important to understand where our risks are, and then to develop plans and contingencies to deal with those. As we empower people to make decisions based on all of this thinking in our organization, that will enable leadership to act with wisdom, with understanding and knowledge based on the circumstances that they're facing. Now, amidst any environment, we're going to encounter stress. And it's important to think about and understand that stress is potentially a good thing and can lead to improved outcomes in many circumstances. But there is a circumstance where stress can become toxic and direct towards overload and failure. And this is largely associated with the resources that are expended to mitigate the stress. So if we reach a situation where this level of resources is required to mitigate the stress, and we have those resources, then it's going to be tolerable stress, and our stress levels will go down and will continue to function. But if those resources are not available, we'll be more likely to be in this toxic stress level, and therefore potentially leading to overload. So this critical issue of thinking about what resources are available for personnel, for circumstances to respond, this is very important. And this is where the financial resilience comes in. This is where the emotional capital with clients, where the individual resilience within employees is very important, because those are the things that determine what resources you have available when you rise to this potential level of toxic stress. Well, so let's talk a little bit more about threat analysis. This is really asking ourselves the question, what could go wrong? Where are the gaps in this potential plan? And pausing to ask that question is really, really important. There are a couple of ways of doing that. One is a more formal way called failure mode effect analysis, where you can take a process or a decision and evaluate, the various ways in which it could fail and how serious they would be. You can also just use the so-called 5 what ifs. This is sort of a takeoff on the lean thinking of the five whys. But if you just ask yourself that question over and over and over, what if this happens? Well, what if that happens? And then what if this happens? Then you will begin to get to the stage where you might see both a degree of what the potential outcomes are and so forth. Ideally, you've got some sort of contingency planning or disaster plan, not just a binder on the shelf, but a real plan in people's minds and work policies and so forth that allow them to cope with some of these issues as they begin to come along. So let's just talk a little bit more about the failure mode effects analysis, because this is a quite widely employed tool in some areas, particularly in design. You see it's got some color coding here, and the matrix is centered around 2 issues. How serious is the defect? And then how frequently does it occur, as opposed to, and related to that, how likely is it to be detected? So something can be fairly frequent, but highly likely to be detected, and therefore it's fixable and is not going to rise to a high risk. But if something is a very high severity, even if it has a moderately good chance of being detected at frequency, that's potentially a problem. So you see how you can begin to color code this, and from this, then you say, well, I want to have something that's going to protect me from anything that's red or orange here. And so I'm going to do that analysis to make that happen. Let's just take this maybe a step further in the laboratory, and specifically an anatomic pathology laboratory. So the wrong patient label on a slide. How often does that happen? Well, it's very rare. And how likely are we to detect that? What mechanism would have to happen for us to detect it? Well, it would have to pass the check at case assembly. It would have to pass the check when the pathologist looks at it and says, gee, this isn't the right tissue. But yet, how severe is the outcome? Well, potentially this is catastrophic. And so this sort of thing would move this into a high priority issue to minimize and to employ every method possible to avoid this happening. Oh, how about the wrong stain getting done? Well, not very often that's going to happen. Maybe it gets done in the wrong block. Well, likelihood of detection, yeah, we'll pick that out. Is it a severe delay? Well, no, it's just a delay. And so this might get a lower score. And so you see the way that we work through these thought processes and begin to assign some level of priority score. And there are ways to quantify this, of course, if you wish, but we've just done it in a qualitative manner here to illustrate some of the potential failure modes that might be encountered in the handling of a surgical pathology specimen. Now, in a lot of circumstances, we see disaster drills. And is this something that is likely to help us? Well, there may be circumstances where this is useful. And if not, when we detect a failure, then we may want to do a reverse disaster drill. How did this happen? Sort of thing. But most of the time, I would say a disaster drill is most useful when multiple entities must interact for there to be a successful outcome. So when the emergency technicians, the fire department, the ambulance, the hospitals, the helicopters, all must interact successfully to triage and manage the patients, well, that's a situation where you need to practice working together. In the laboratory, we work together all the time, so maybe a disaster drill is not quite so useful. But on the hospital level, well, yes, we do have to interact under disaster circumstances at various times, and we are in different divisions, so maybe on a hospital level, a drill may be more useful. So those are some of my thoughts on that topic. Now, another interesting characterization of resilient organizations is that they have the capability to develop or create new markets and new opportunities. I think that's a key to their longevity, because essentially, you can go along making the same widget, turning out the same results, but something will happen. A new analysis will come along, or a completely new technology will come along, or a different client will come along. And if we can't adapt into those spaces, we will eventually become outmoded and die a natural death. So this ability to develop a new market is very, very important. So here in Oklahoma, one of our famous exhibits is of the Chihuly glass. Here are amazingly shaped, colored, diverse shapes in glass. Dale Chihuly, to me, is a person who took a craft and created an entirely new market for a particular type of art and artwork using his tools and techniques. And so now you find Chihuly glass in academic centers, in hospitals, in museums, in homes, in amazing places with this fanciful and exotic shapes and colors, all based on his ability to create a desire for something beautiful and elegant and maybe a little whimsical or imaginative that we don't see every day. Well, let's conclude with a couple of quick case studies to try and review some of the things we've talked about. So here's case study one. In the wee hours of the morning, there were some rather difficult shock waves. Back in September 2010, down in New Zealand, if you were living in Christchurch, you were awakened by this earthquake. And that was the case for the owner of a particular salon named the True Grit Salon. But she was not awakened by the earthquake. Rather, she was awakened by a phone call to notify her that this earthquake had hit, and her salon was in shambles, as you can see here. So what is the first thing to do? What do you do? How do you respond to that emergency, that crisis, that sudden stress, aside from being awakened and, as she did here, returning quickly to her place? Well, what would we look for first? Would we be most concerned about clients and safety? Well, yeah, probably, but it was early in the morning, so those are unlikely to be involved. Should she be thinking about equipment? Should she be thinking about her IT and data? Should she be thinking about where am I going to go to work? How am I going to get my money back for my business? Or what's that going to come? What do I tell my staff, et cetera, et cetera? Where do I do these things? Well, so you can think in your mind and think, what would I do first? What would be the most important thing here? And just before we go on to the next slide, just ask yourself, which on this is the most important thing? Well, here's what she did. The first thought she had was, I can't function if I don't know my clients, if I don't have my data. And that server was in the area, it was in my damaged salon. So she and her IT administrator went to work to recover data and salvage what she could. Secondly, Jackie contacted her staff and informed them, we don't have work today. And enlisted them, of course, in the search for alternative locations. Enlisted them in working to reschedule clients once they had their database recovered. A short time later, they were able to tentatively get back into the site to recover potentially salvageable equipment. So the dryers, the clippers, and other sorts of equipment that might be still of potential use. Through contacts with others, she developed potential temporary spaces, as you can see them here, cutting hair on the doorsteps of another organization. There were multiple temporary spaces, and this required a great degree of adaptability on the part both of the organization, the clients, as well as the employees and staff of the organization. But ultimately, they survived, and in the end, this experience made them stronger, and they came back together. And it became a nice example, a teaching example of what an organization can do in the face of a sudden, really devastating crisis. Okay, case study number 2. This one a little bit closer to home. The COVID pandemic, a very recent one. So a given medical center becoming aware that their region would soon be facing an unknown burden of new cases, but a number that they didn't know, but that could potentially overwhelm their institution, they began to think about what they were going to do for testing. They, of course, at the beginning had no test online, and they knew that they would need a fairly robust method to be able to get tests through and turned around, because people who come in with symptoms were people under investigation. And of course, they have to treat those people like they're infected and isolate them and take precautions and so forth until they can either say, yep, you got it, or no, you're not. And then once they're not, they can move into a more routine standard of care. Well, if you've got 4 or 5 day turnaround before you can rule somebody out and you keep bringing new people in, pretty soon your whole institution is going to be snowed under with people under investigation. So this was a real priority, to get a viable test that had a reasonable turnaround. Problem was, you can't buy it. A lot of the reagents were lacking, the controls were questionable value. We had some equipment that could be used for PCR testing, but it certainly was not set up on a scale of the kind of scale that we anticipated with COVID. On top of that, many of the supply chains were disrupted by the clampdowns in transportation and entry exits and so forth. So getting certain supplies was really impossible, or long delays. We of course had no processes. We didn't have space for conducting this type of testing, collecting specimens, and our personnel were not organized to be able to manage this pandemic. So this is a crisis. How did we respond? Well, the resilience in this situation was quite creative, I thought. First of all, on the reagent side of things, because the academic side of the research side of the campus had closed down, and that these research laboratories often had testing media, often had tubes, had swabs, and so forth, we immediately scoured campus in search of these sorts of things to requisition them for secondary use in patient care. Not to compromise care, but using patient standard materials that could be used. Additionally, we began to look at alternative sample types, whether it was saliva or blood or other mechanisms to validate different samples that could be potentially indicative of disease. Personnel, we redeployed personnel from one area to another to begin to organize and set up the testing sites to create new places for patient intake. We know of this happening in many laboratories across the country. Of course, one of the more notable ones being a department chairman who ended up, swabbing nasal canals to collect specimens in their drive-up testing center. And then in terms of equipment, some brainstorming and collaborative work of the team ultimately led to developing and applying a whole new methodology using microfluidics to handle a high volume of anticipated testing. Amazingly, this led to FDA application for emergency use authorization, and the test was approved. So now the Oklahoma COVID test is available. Additionally, the leadership of the hospital were supportive of fast-tracking certain purchase orders for equipment as well as reagents to help manage this influx of new testing and new challenges. And then processes were likewise revised, and the whole institution pivoted to be able to handle this sort of thing until ultimately our capacity was several thousand tests each day. And the turnaround was less than 24 hours, which allowed very routine patients to be tested prior to elective visits to the institution, and thus give a high predictive safety value to new uninfected patients coming into the process. And then that in turn allowed a great normalization of many of the other operations of the institution, which were really quite frozen for a period of time when non-elective surgery was totally abandoned. So all of this was a nice demonstration, I think, of many of the key learnings in becoming resilient. The teams formed quickly and they worked creatively, proactively with one another to manage the barriers that they encountered, to cope with the obstacles. There was no single decision maker, but everyone engaged on the team was involved with that. There was a very robust daily communication network throughout the organization that kept different areas aware of what the challenges and capabilities were, gave periodic updates to people not involved directly in testing with what was going on, or not involved directly with clinical care with what was going on, and so forth. Dashboards, things like that are very useful in this kind of situation. And of course, we're still in the midst of this and get daily reports of progress or regress in this circumstance. And then creatively developing new solutions by drawing on hidden or latent skills in the team members. We didn't know that some of our trainees had the experience with microfluidics that could allow them to develop a new test. But when the opportunity came, they were prepared, they brought that to the table, and that paradigm created a great new combination outcome. Well, I hope these cases have been useful, and I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation on building and motivating one another to build a resilient workspace and a resilient organization. I hope that you'll today do something to enhance your own resilience, reduce your stress, and also think about ways that your organization can become more resilient for the future. We look forward to having you join us again, so please subscribe, hit that button, and let your friends know about this video if you found it useful. And so until next time, thanks for joining us.